With back-to-back World Cup wins, the Springboks are suddenly the team everyone wants to beat. It's been a long road in getting to the pinnacle of the world game. This week, we look at some of the new stars and what they bring to the Springbok mix, and how Rassie's books are placed to face the future. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup, and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about some of the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred, and welcome to the show. In 1984, just over 40 and a bit years ago, the Wallabies toured Great Britain for an 18-match tour. It was to turn out to be one of the greatest trips north ever undertaken by a Wallaby side. Under captain Andrew Slack and coach Alan Jones, the Wallabies lost matches against Cardiff, Llanelli, Ulster and south of Scotland, but more importantly, they beat all four home unions convincingly to become the first Australian team before or since to win the Grand Slam. In the four internationals, they conceded only a single try by Welsh scrum half David Bishop, and their margins of victory were so impressive that they're worth repeating. They beat England by 16 points, Ireland by 7 points, and Wales by 19 points, scoring 4 tries, only worth 4 points in those days, in the process. Against Scotland, in the last international on tour, they scored 37 points, including 4 tries to 4 penalties against, for a 37-12 victory. 2 of the tries at Murrayfield that day were scored by a 19-year-old Wallaby winger of Italian descent from the New South Wales backlands. He was to become, as we're about to find out, rather famous. His name was David Campese, a player who was beginning to develop a reputation for himself as elegant, hard-running, and opportunistic as a wing and full-back. Campese was shy off the park, even socially awkward, but on it he was loud. You couldn't miss him. In many ways, he was louder than words. Campese wasn't only strong, pacey, and unpredictable, he had a calling card, something that set him apart from his talented teammates. Most of us know it as the Campese goose step, but as James Curran's recent book on Campese tells us, it's better known in Aussie as the Struggle Town Shuffle. The name for Campo's goose step came about because the small town in New South Wales in which Campese was brought up, Queanbeyan, was full of immigrants from Europe who arrived there in the 1950s and 1960s. The local council realized that these immigrant families from Germany, Greece, Macedonia and Italy couldn't afford to build permanent houses, so stringent housing regulations were temporarily relaxed. Lean-tos, shanties, and cobbled-together do-it-yourself structures sprung up, much to long-time residents' ire. Struggle Town came to be born. Soon it produced a rugby dance of its own, the Struggle Town Shuffle. Born in 1962, Campese was the son of Italian immigrant parents who'd arrived in Australia in the early 1950s. His father, Giantonio Campese, came from a village close to Venice. Although a French polisher by trade, he was quickly working on the Snowy River hydroelectric scheme. It comes as no surprise to learn that his Aussie mates quickly dubbed him Tony. All Tony's son, David, wanted to do was play sport. It didn't matter whether it was golf or cricket. Rugby league, he soon discovered, wasn't for him, but perhaps union, for which he showed early promise, was. Campese left school at 16. By 17, he'd made his debut playing 4th grade rugby for the local Queanbeyan side, the Whites. His rise was meteoric. 2 years later, he was called up for Australia on their July 1982 tour of New Zealand, alongside the 3 famous Ella brothers, Mark, Glenn and Gary. The tour to New Zealand took place at a fractious time in Australian rugby. Queensland rugby fans weren't happy with the selection policies of then Wallaby coach Bob Dwyer, and 9 players, many of them Queenslanders, made themselves unavailable. 17 members of the touring squad had never played international rugby before. When the Wallabies crossed the Tasman, their luggage contained unusually heavy baggage, the baggage of trepidation. Despite the inexperience of the touring Wallabies, they acquitted themselves well. Having lost the first test to the All Blacks, they narrowly won the second, losing the decider. Campese made his debut in the first test loss at Christchurch, memorably stepping around much vaunted New Zealand winger Stu Wilson. Playing alongside, Mark Eller marvelled at Campese's insouciance. Quote, "What have we got here?" he mused. Not all Wallabies were as keen on the Struggle Town shuffle. Some moaned, not without merit, that Campese's unpredictability meant you never knew what he was about to do. Where should you be when you didn't know where he would be? Hell, he didn't seem to know where he'd be himself. The loose forwards, in particular, found his off-the-cuff brilliance trying as they tried to predict his next move. Not everyone struggled to the same degree. In his book on Campo, Curran quotes Mark Ellis saying the following, quote, "My brothers and I were able to read Campese and more often than not were able to anticipate him. When Campese took off, we might see that he had, say, 2 immediate options, but that in either case he would have to come right eventually. As a result, we would head to the right, taking the shortcut in other words, and meeting him in the middle of the field." Curran rightly notes in his chapter on the beginning of Campese's international career that not enough has been made of the relationship between him and the Ellers. Not enough has been written, he adds, about who they were and where they came from. Campese was the son of a French polisher from Italy who perfected the Struggle Town shuffle, while the Ellers were Australians of Aboriginal descent. In their unique way, they widened the conception of who could play for the Wallabies and what, therefore, the Wallabies became. None of them went to the private schools in Queensland or New South Wales, as most Wallabies usually did. The traditional pathways weren't theirs. To the sport, they brought their daring, their difference and flair. They also brought their view of the world, their quiet insistence that the world they came from wasn't necessarily the world played in by the Slacks, Michael Liners and Simon Poidevins of this world. South African listeners will find it easy to see where I'm going with this. Campese has come out recently and said some ego-swelling things about Sasha Feinberg Mgomezulu, and Campo no doubt sees some of his youthful self in the audacious young fly-half and utility back. Sasha not only has talent to burn, he has a story to tell, a story that chimes exceedingly well with the times. His grandfather was the late Barry Feinberg, a poet, graphic artist, cultural desk activist, and ANC member who fled from South Africa because of apartheid to go into exile in England, where his son Nick was born. Nick, Sasha's dad, has felt the tug of both his birthplace and South Africa, but for Sasha, identity is more straightforward. He's a South African through and through. He always wanted to pull on the green and gold. When he returned from his exile years, Barry used to watch Sasha, his grandson, play for Bishops in Cape Town's southern suburbs when Sasha was growing up. Unfortunately, Barry, the ANC activist, never saw his grandson become a Springbok because he died last year. It would have been impossible for the mixed-race grandson of a white anti-apartheid exile activist to become a Springbok even as recently as 20 years ago. But as South Africa changes, so too does rugby, although rugby also contributes to a changing society by illustrating what can be achieved through talent and hard work. What exactly do I mean by my use of the word impossible? Well, it would have been generationally impossible for a grandson of an ANC activist to play for the Boks 20 years ago because such grandsons wouldn't have been old enough. They might not even have been born. But it would have also been literally unthinkable too, because the system wouldn't have tolerated it. Can you imagine, say, an Andre Markgraaff, the former Springbok coach, with his backward-looking conservatism, picking Sasha? The very notion is ridiculous. It's like asking a human being to fall upwards. But Rassie Erasmus, and to a lesser extent Jacques Nienaber, are more open-minded, shrewder, more historically sensitive, more attuned to the optics than any Springbok coach ever has been. Not only does Rassie have a system with a wider base from which to choose players, he is currently experiencing one of his legacies of success, the luxury of being able to plan for the future. He knows Siya Kolisi is 33 and Eben Etzebeth turns 33 in October. He knows that the, quote, Malmesbury missile, Pieter-Steph du Toit, has just turned 31 and is increasingly being held together by willpower alone. Age-wise, Handré Pollard isn't far behind Pieter-Steph. Erasmus knows that rugby is a physically taxing, brutal and attritional game, particularly but not exclusively for the forwards, and some of his stalwarts are running out of time. In this regard, Rassie is only too happy for the idle talk about Sasha being a Springbok captain-elect to swirl about in the media. It keeps Siya honest, and it will inspire Salman Murat, the book skipper for the second test against the Wallabies, to not get ahead of himself and take too much for granted. So, the game is changing, and it is changing quickly, as Rassie begins his relentless quest to defend the World Cup crown in 2027. Organically, without hue and cry, Springboks are coming from all races and coming from everywhere, like Campese and the Ella brothers did for Australia before them. Rugby, once associated with Afrikanerdom and apartheid, has refashioned itself as the people's game. Forgive me while I interrupt a sports story to tell you about the Luke Alfred Show Patreon. As you may know, being a writer is not the most lucrative career choice. Please consider making a small donation to keep the show going at patreon.com/The Luke Alfred Show. But for now, let's get back to the story. Older listeners will rightfully point out that South African rugby players have always come from everywhere, with that everywhere conveniently called, quote, the platteland, roughly translated as the country districts. But now that everywhere is producing players of all colours, shapes and sizes, whether this be Lucanio who went to school in King Williamstown, or Ben Jason Dixon, who went to school in Stellenbosch. This is different to how it used to be, where talented players like Brayton Paulser and Brian Habana and J.P. Peterson were literally marginalised and hived off to the wing. Counting 2 replacements for those who injured themselves in the initial 2007 World Cup squad, Jake White called up 32 players to the tournament in France. Of those 32, 6 were so-called coloured players, including some names you might have forgotten, like Ricky January and Wayne Julies, who was drafted into the squad as a late replacement for the injured Jean de Villiers. In the entire squad of 32, there was just one black African player, Akona Ndangane, and his role in the tournament was negligible. And we're not talking about the really dark days here, like the 1980s or 1990s either. We're talking 2007, only 17 years ago. Born in 1991, Siya Kolisi was 16 when the 2007 Rugby World Cup came around. At 16, he was just beginning to create a bit of a reputation for himself at Grey High in what was then Port Elizabeth, and might have seen in rugby an avenue of potential possibility, if not potentially rich reward. The win for Jake White's team would surely have made a profound impression upon Siya, although one wonders what his private thoughts were when it came to not seeing a single black player wearing the treasured green and gold. Kolisi reminds me a little bit of Arjuna Ranatunga, the portly left-hander who led Sri Lanka to her Cricket World Cup victory over Australia in 1996. As Kumar Sangakkara points out in his 2011 Sir Colin Cowdrey lecture on, quote, the spirit of cricket, which we'll hear an excerpt from shortly, Ranatunga recognized that for Sri Lankan cricket to be fully Sri Lankan, it needed to move away from the shadow of colonialism and post-colonialism and forge its own cricket identity.
The leadership of Arjuna during this period was critical to our emergence as a global force. It was Arjuna who understood most clearly why we needed to break free from the shackles of our colonial past and forge a new identity. An identity forged exclusively from Sri Lankan values, an identity that fed from the passion, vibrancy, and emotions of normal Sri Lankans.
It also needed to move away from stale coaching orthodoxies and find players who represented the carefree flair, sense of humour, and improvisatory brilliance of the islanders. In Sanath Jayasuriya and Muttiah Muralitharan, Ranatunga found two such players. He built the island's newfound cricket identity around them. Murali started out as a fast bowler, but soon realized that he could use a natural deformity in his arm to good effect as a wrist-spinning off-spinner. As Sangakkara reminds us, it was the Aussie skipper Alan Border who said on first facing Murali that, quote, "He's a leg spinner, but hell, he bowls a fair whack of googlies." The point here is that Sri Lankan cricket needed to discover what was unique about her cricket before she could compete with the best in the world. And she needed to do so based on the sensible and entirely pragmatic assumption that utilizing what was to hand and fashioning it to her ends was the only way to gain competitive advantage. The rest of the cricket-playing world was, after all, more prosperous. It was more settled, not having to live through the debilitating and traumatic effects of a long-term civil war. It was surer of itself, unlike the Sri Lankans who were, more often than not, insecure and wide-eyed. Ceylon only became Sri Lanka in 1948, a tiny island dwarfed by India up above and Pakistan above that. She was only granted test status by the International Cricket Council in 1981. Finally, the Sri Lankans were insecure because they had big-time identity issues. Deep down, they weren't sure of who they really were. South African rugby has always had a solid foundation on which to build, that foundation resting on the Herculean endeavours of the forwards. But lurking just beneath the surface was insecurity. There was apartheid, there was isolation, there was the disadvantage of being almost buried at the bottom of a continent people were wildly ignorant about that was itself at the bottom of the world. How else does one explain the well-documented reflex to crisis in South African rugby? How else does one explain the, often desperate, need to show the world who was boss? How else does one explain the endless, often tortuous moments of anguish? Think of Corne Krikke's implosion at Twickenham in 2002, in which the Boks, on the back of 2 defeats, lost the plot as the match careered into mayhem and the Boks plunged to a record 53-3 defeat. Think of the other implosions, cave-ins, earthquakes. Think of Kamp Staaldraad. Think of the Peter de Villiers experiment. Think of Louis Late's Trump-like craziness, tolerated at the time, but, with the benefit of hindsight, best characterized as a reign of boorishness and bluster. Consider, finally, the wisdom of making Harry Viljoen and Karel du Plessis national coaches. I rest my case. Such insecurities have evaporated as the result of back-to-back World Cup wins in 2019 and 2023, and the arrival of Sia and Jacques Nienaber and Rassie Erasmus. They have evaporated because the Springboks are going through a remarkably successful patch, but they've also evaporated because you feel that all the talent at our disposal is being used in a way that gives best expression to that talent. Our players, finally, have embraced their unique versions of Campo's Struggle Town Shuffle. And, like Sasha, they have pedigrees and backgrounds which Springboks of older generations didn't have. Such backgrounds are more similar to those of Campese and the 3 Ella brothers and have the added advantage of bringing a slightly different style to proceedings. We left Campese at the beginning of this podcast in 1984, just after the Wallabies' successful Grand Slam tour of the British Isles. After conquering the North, the Australians needed one more notch on their bedpost and duly went to New Zealand for the Bledisloe Cup in 1986, determined to beat the All Blacks in their paddock. If they did so, remember, these were pre-World Cup days, they could legitimately claim the title of the best team in the world. New Zealand rugby was not in a happy place at the time. The Kiwi players who had gone to South Africa with the Cavaliers would only be available for the second test because of their two-match ban, and there was much talk of a rift down the middle of New Zealand rugby. Campese had an eventful first test, scoring a try, making the deciding pass that led to another, and then throwing out a wildly speculative pass across the field, which led to the All Blacks creeping back in. Finally, the Wallabies snuck home by a point, 13-12, before losing by exactly the same margin in the second test. Winning the series, and so the Bledisloe Cup in the third, didn't, however, mean that when the inaugural World Cup came around a year later, they could rest on their laurels. In the 1987 World Cup semi-final, they lost a high-scoring match to France. 1984 and the Grand Slam seemed like an eternity away. The dream was over. It would take 4 years and the ruthlessness of Jones's successor, Bob Dwyer, for Campese to find himself at another World Cup. In 1988, Dwyer had brought in new blood, turfing some of the players who'd lost to France in the previous year's World Cup semi-final loss. Fullback Roger Gould simply walked out of camp and flew home. Dwyer drafted in a young hooker called Phil Kearns, who had been playing in the second team at Randwick in the Sydney suburbs. When Tim Horan and Jason Little, soon to be famous as a centre pairing, played for the Wallabies for the first time, they hadn't yet represented their state, Queensland. The key fixture of the 1991 World Cup, from an Australian point of view, was against the old enemy, New Zealand, in the semi-final. Poidevin has referred to it subsequently as, quote, Fraser versus Ali, and many Australians believe the Wallabies' first half is the finest half of rugby that they've ever played. Ever the maverick, Campese dealt with the haka by not fronting up to it, but wandering in the outfield lost in thoughts of his own. Suspicions of uninterest were unfounded. Campese scored his first try by coming off his wing and gliding diagonally across the field without a hand being laid upon him as he dotted down in the corner. His next moment of off-the-cuff brilliance was his no-look pass to Tim Horan, who was running off his right shoulder while Campo was looking left. It's fodder for 1,000 YouTube highlights reels, but you should still try and see it again for old time's sake, because it's just so masterful. Take a listen to the commentary for both the Campese and the Horan try Campese made on these two linked snippets, and take the pulse of the excitement in the commentator's voice for yourself.
Here's the ruck ball for Australia. Here they go, Campese. It must be through. Here's Campese. The bounce important. Campese. Yes. Horan. Oh, wonderful.
The Wallabies won the semi-final against the Blackness 16-6 and then beat England at Twickenham in a grubby final. The architect of the Struggle Town Shuffle finally had his World Cup winners' medal. We forget that it was many years of Struggle Town for the Springboks prior to their back-to-back World Cup wins. Yes, there were successes, but there were also World Cup defeats to Japan and European Tour defeats away to Italy. Every step forward appeared to be accompanied by 2 steps back. In the space of 5 or 6 years, with the 2 back-to-back World Cup wins, all that has changed. Organically, rugby in South Africa has moved away from its conservative Afrikaans roots and become the people's game. A more equitable society has changed rugby, in that young rugby players are now coming from everywhere, but rugby has also changed a more equitable society. How so? It has changed a society because the Boks have demonstrated that nothing succeeds like success. As South Africans, we are proud of the Springboks, as we are proud of a little else. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please give me a 5-star rating. As an independent creator, this podcast is made possible through your support.